Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live stream edition of Adam's Music Box. It's Saturday, and that's all right for fighting. So says Elton John. Doesn't look like the type that would get into fights on a Saturday night. Oh well. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about some general stuff that I found amusing in no particular order. I guess that we'll start with the Alan Parsons project because he's really been on a roll over the last few years when it comes to re-releasing his classic albums from the Alan Parsons project, and this will typically include a very nicely done remaster of the original album, and of course, as Parsons was a pioneer in mixing music albums in surround sound, he'll usually do his own surround sound mix of those albums because as good as a surround sound mixer as he was, I don't think any of the original Alan Parsons albums were done in the quadraphonic format of the time, which had kind of tapered off by the late 70s when the group really started to become big. But the one that's coming out at the end of this month is a special edition of Pyramid, the third album from the Alan Parsons project, and one that I really, really like. It sometimes gets overshadowed by some of the big boys on either side of it, but it's a wonderful, wonderful album. Now, the Alan Parsons Project is a group whose style kind of defies categorization, and I kind of like that because there are really only three kinds of bands. There are bands that define a musical category because they invented it. There are bands that follow the existing trends, and some of those can do their job very well, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're particularly original. And then there are those bands that didn't really reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, they weren't formulaic either. And they are the ones that defy explanation. And I would really put the Alan Parsons Project in that category. Because what were they really? Were they an AOR band? Well, they weren't even really a band. And in that sense, they were the best band to never be a band. They were a production and songwriting partnership between Alan Parsons, who brought to the table a wonderful sense of production, engineering, arrangement and composition for many varieties of instruments. And then Eric Wolfson, his partner in the Alan Parsons project, was the one who wrote most of the lyrics and the sort of melody structures themselves, which were then embellished by Alan. And they formed a really good team. And the only reason they didn't call it the Parsons Wolfson project is because Wolfson kind of wanted to be a bit in the background. And that worked out really well. I mean, it even made it to Austin Powers, where, what was it? I think Dr. Evil's plan to end the world with a giant laser beam was codenamed the Alan Parsons Project. But the fact that it does sound more like a kind of biotech company than a band is kind of interesting because it wasn't a band as such. Now, of course, bands of musicians played on each one of the albums, and they were great musicians, but they were a combination of session musicians, of musicians who had successful solo careers, semi-successful solo careers, or musicians from other bands that would be given a phone call by Alan or Eric and saying, why don't we do this together? And because both men were so respected within the world of musicians at the time, that they got some really interesting and talented people to perform on the albums. So it wasn't really a band as such. It wasn't like, everyone knows the names of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin, but the people in the Alan Parsons Project varied not only from album to album, but in many cases from song to song. And what that did is it freed Alan and Eric to compose almost as though they were orchestral classical composers, whereby they had a vision for a composition and they would find the appropriate ensemble to perform it. And that was something very, very effective. And yes, this is, of course, done in the classical world. It's done in the world of film scoring. It's done in the world of experimental music. But in the 70s world of rock, it wasn't very common. people wanted to know their rock stars. They were members of fan clubs. They bought magazines about them. They read the detailed liner notes. Everyone said, oh, well, I think John Paul Jones is the coolest member of Led Zeppelin. No, it's all about Bonham, man, or, Bad Company. Boz Burrell on bass. He's the one that makes the band. I mean, and you could go on and on and on. Oh, yeah, Journey was better when Greg Rowley was the keyboardist, not Jonathan Cain, because people knew the names of the people in their favorite bands. And again, this was an age when rock bands in particular, they wrote their own stuff, performed their own stuff. And unless you were Yes, the lineups were generally consistent, at least within a 5 to 10 year window. Deep Purple, maybe a bit less than 5 years at a time, but what's the difference between friends? But Alan Parsons' project defied that, and they were a band that were really all about composition and about studio magic. Now, Alan Parsons, again, didn't necessarily define the sound of 70s production, but he made it really, really quintessential. He was one of the best sound engineers of the 70s, and he really helped propel that 70s sound, whether it was on Pink Floyd records like Dark Side of the Moon that he engineered, or on his own stuff. And let's look at how we would define that sound. I would say that it is all about balance between the instruments, balance between the highs, mids, and lows, balance in terms of dynamic range. 70s production style isn't particularly aggressive, but nor is it ill-defined. It's about balance and definition working as closely in concert as possible. And that's not to say that every 70s album sounded the same. Of course it didn't. But in the music industry, certain recording and engineering and production trends do emerge. One of the problems with early heavy rock in the mid and late 60s is that close miking of the instruments and having a sophisticated enough mixing console to keep a good balance when everything is really loud, it wasn't really feasible. So you'd end up having drummers who played really loud live sounding very quiet. Think of Ginger Baker on Fresh Cream. Or you'd have guitarists who were normally very powerful, not having much definition because everything tended to distort. And this wasn't because music engineers were bad in the 60s. Au contraire, some of the best stuff was actually done in the 50s and early 60s when it comes to jazz. Think of the Blue Note records. Think of the Columbia jazz albums like Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, Sketches of Spain. Think of some of the best classical recordings ever. People on Decca, what was his name? John Coleshaw, one of the best engineers and producers of classical music, with his wonderful Decca tree that is now used by everyone just about in classical recording. The RCA Living Stereo recordings of the 50s and 60s, the Mercury Living Presence. So 50s and 60s records, when it comes to classical and jazz, are some of the best sounding and therefore most valuable records ever. But when you introduced loud, electronically amplified instruments like the electric guitar, and when you introduced drummers that were generally playing louder than your typical jazz drummer, you had engineers. There was a bit of a learning gap, but by the late 60s, people had learned how to make the drums of people like John Bonham or Ginger Baker sound big, and make the guitar of people like Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or Robin Trower or John McLaughlin in the jazz world sound big, like it needed to be. And so the next phase of development was all about balance, because the 70s was an age where there were lots of microphones. Every tom-tom started to get mic'd on the drum set. Multiple mics at various different lengths away from the guitar and the bass amps. Same with keyboard instruments that were amplified with standalone amps, like a Leslie attached to a Hammond organ, for example. And Alan Parsons was a master at creating balance between all of that. Just listen, for instance, to Dark Side of the Moon, and the best engineered of all of the tracks on that, The Great Gig in the Sky. Wonderful stuff. Perfect balance, piano, organ, drums, vocals, perfect. And Alan Parsons took that to all of his albums, which is why listening to them is such a treat. because unlike the sort of wall of sound production, which wasn't on all 60s pop records by any means, but it became very popular, that's where you sacrifice definition for power, the power of multiple things going on at once, which sounded really good on an AM radio, but when you listen to it on a high-priced hi-fi system, you're thinking, where's the definition? Alan Parsons was someone who was emblematic of the best of the 70s production style, insofar as you could crank it up, hear instruments in definition and in separation, but they weren't hitting you over the head because the dynamic range was balanced. So that's the sound of the Alan Parsons albums. And in terms of the musicality, there was so much variation, and it was held together by this wonderful production style. So, for instance, some Alan Parsons Project songs are almost pop songs that you could class as, you could call them love songs, really. Um, Pop ballads, progressive rock, experimental, ambient, sometimes things that verged on the hard rock, though they weren't known for doing the hard stuff, but there was so much songwriting excellence that they were able to have a soft ballad come after something that was funky and soulful coming after a ballad. I mean, frankly, if this was something that was not composed by, but rather performed by a major solo artist, it would have been one of the absolute top hits of all time. And this Alan Parsons song is If I Could Change Your Mind. And this was from the 1979 album Eve. And it was sung by a session musician who was also a singer-songwriter called Leslie Duncan, who sadly died in 2010. And this song, if it was released by one of the great, let's say Angela Bofill, a great singer who could have done that song wonderfully, it would have been a #1 hit. But because it was on a rock album that was so anonymized, it didn't become that. But in spite of the intended anonymization of the Alan Parsons Project, they sold very well, and they were particularly liked in Canada. And there's a guy, I doubt you're listening to this, but a guy called Mike Dawson in LA. He himself is a sound engineer, he's a musician, he's a stand-up comedian, and a podcast producer, and he is obsessed with Alan Parsons, so much so that Alan, even when he tours and plays in California, now that he does live shows, as he had started to do in the late 80s, because the project in its heyday never did live shows. He lets Dawson do stand-up perform. So shout out to Mike Dawson, great guy, flying that Alan Parsons flag loudly and proudly. But all of the albums of the Alan Parsons Project were unique. They were almost dramatic, like a West End or Broadway show type of thing. And that was kind of fitting that sort of the tail end of the Alan Parsons Project was something called Freudiana that was kind of marketed as a solo effort by Eric Wolfson. But in many ways, you could also say that it was the final Parsons Project album. And this was actually intended to be a full-scale musical. I don't think it was ever performed live in the 80s. It was done in 1988, but I do think some productions were done later on. I'll have to double check on that. So if you're not into Alan Parsons or have only heard of him because of Austin Powers, I would definitely check out his albums. I would say that his most accessible album is probably Ammonia Avenue, followed very closely by Eye in the Sky. And Eye in the Sky probably made them a lot of money, I would think, because in their glory days, the Chicago Bulls would do their walkout into the arena to the opening track from Eye in the Sky, which is called Serious. Just go to YouTube once my video is done and Google look for, well, it's owned by Google, so I guess we can say Google without getting into trouble. Go to Chicago Bulls entrance music from the Michael Jordan era, and you'll see Serious. We've got a comment. I'm just going to read that. My production partner for 20 years is now keyboard and MD. Oh, that's awesome. I take you mean for Alan Parsons. That's amazing because, yeah, when the project ended per se, Alan started to do solo albums, but he also started to take project material out on the road with live musicians. And it's something that they could have always done. But much like the Beatles in their sort of middle and late career, or Steely Dan after the first handful of albums, they were a studio project. But Alan is more than capable of both doing vocals and keys live, and he's been going strong now for about 30 years. He's been doing live, so just a spring chicken. That's very cool. So this is Keith who wrote that, so that's awesome. Give your production partner all my best as Alan continues doing what he does best. And for those of you out there, I'm not getting paid for this, saying this, but pick up the special edition of Pyramid, which is coming out at the end of this month, because the special editions of all of the Alan Parsons Project albums are done very well, and Alan meticulously goes through these. Incidentally, speaking of Dark Side of the Moon and surround sound, I love the quadraphonic mix of Dark Side of the Moon, and this was something that apparently caused some tension between the guys in Pink Floyd and Alan himself. When it comes to the stereo mix, which is the mix that 98% of music listeners heard at the time and since, they were all sort of doing it together, and the guys in Pink Floyd are known for being very, very opinionated. But when it came to the quad mix, the band were kind of nonchalant. They didn't really care. So they let Alan have his way with it, and he did some really interesting things, forgetting the spatial nature of the fact that 4 channels will sound different than 2. He took some different decisions in terms of balance. There were some parts that were either inaudible or maybe not even there in the stereo mix that were turned louder. For instance, the vocals are much more upfront in Great Gig in the Sky, as is the organ, where on the stereo mix, the organ and piano are kind of similar in terms of their levels. So there's interesting stuff like that. And I think that, like many bands have now done, I think Purple has done it with some of their albums, Sabbath has done it with some, just make a 2-channel fold down of the quad mix so that people with their headphones can hear how the balance of the instruments is different, because people really took their time and they really said, right, we're not just going to make the quad mix a more spaced out version of the 2 channels. Some, to be fair, did, but Alan Parsons with Dark Side of the Moon did not. He really made it a different kind of mix, and I think at one point he later said he wished he had more time on it. You could always have that. But he also, when James Guthrie did a 5.1 version of Dark Side of the Moon in the early 2000s, that was really super tame. That was just the stereo version with a bit of spacey things going on here or there. But that's just how it is. Yeah, so let's move on to the next topic. I'm just getting another message here. The mic is breaking up. Yeah, I think that's something to do with YouTube. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But give us a thumbs up if you can hear the important bits, which hopefully you can. So there's another thing that's on my mind on this live stream, which is an interesting article that quotes Wolf Van Halen. Now, I don't know why people like attacking Wolf Van Halen so much, but I think I can kind of guess. He's very confident, and he should be, because he's really good at what he does. But a lot of people, pardon me, want him to be submissive and want him to exist to serve the legacy of his father, where his father was very clear that he wanted him to be his own man, and he is his own man. And I think he deserved to be confident. But a lot of people who, dare I say, with issues of their own, attack him for it. But he said something very interesting, and this is being reported at guitar.com. I'm not sure where the interview comes from. I've just got it up in front of me now. I'm going to try to find the quote, which I never can when I want it. So you never find the things you want to find when you want to find them. Okay, here we go. Found the quote. So Wolf says in an interview on the WTF podcast with Mark Maron, he said, in a way, Dad, meaning Eddie Van Halen, kind of ruined the musical landscape, because instead of everybody wanting to find out who they are, they wanted to be like that, like him. People focus on Eddie's guitar playing, but overall it was the fact that Dad is a great songwriter. And that's what I shoot for too. It's not about flashy stuff. I say that that is a great assessment of Eddie, because there have been lots of virtuosic guitar players, and Eddie is one of them, obviously one of the very best in the rock realm, possibly the best. But he's so much more than that. And the reason that people will always remember Eddie isn't because of his great guitar playing alone, but it's what he used it for. And he used it as a great vehicle for songwriting. He was one of the best songwriters of all time. That's why if you hear just one riff of a Van Halen song, whether it's a guitar riff or a keyboard riff, you go, aha, that's a Van Halen song. The riffs, the choruses, the middle eights, everything is, again, if it sticks in your head without you trying to remember it, that is one of the signs, the symptoms, if you will, of great songwriting. And Eddie Van Halen had that in spades. And that's why when you see a lot of these guys who just sort of shred for the sake of it, they don't stay with you as much as Eddie Van Halen's music, because his shredding had a purpose. And the purpose was that it was part and parcel of his great songwriting. So obviously, people online who are able to title their things better than I'm able to title mine, they're going to go for the clickbait. And they're going to say, oh, Wolfgang Van Halen disses his dad. No, 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 that's the clickbait version. The real version is he's saying that rather than people just trying to copy Eddie's great ability to shred, his great soloing, his wonderful technique, why not focus on Eddie's main X factor, which was his great songwriting ability? Because I'll tell you this, as good as he was on guitar, no one would have remembered Van Halen if they weren't great at writing songs. And when I say they, I mean Eddie. He was the songwriter. And that's why they are beloved, when a lot of other virtuosic guitarists from that same era didn't make it as big at the time and are hardly ever discussed today. So I think that's a really good and frankly musically accurate point that Wolf is making, because Eddie was a songwriter first and foremost. And then we're going to something that's a bit silly. It's not directly related to music, but don't you worry, I'll bring it round to that. And that's that Jonathan Cain and Neil Schon, keyboard player and guitar player for Journey, respectively, are suing each other yet again. And I mean, these two, it's kind of becoming like the odd couple. Neil Schon is a Democrat. Jonathan Cain, or at least his wife, is a Trump supporter. This could really be like a reality show, locking them in a room and watching them talk about things. I think it would be really funny. Like, what is it, Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau? But they're suing each other again. This time, it's because Neil Schon has allegedly maxed out the band's credit card, an American Express black card, no less, with $1 million limit. And apparently, he spent $400,000 a month on things like hotel rooms for himself. And Jonathan is pissed off that it's costing the band's touring budget. I think that Neil Schon is also pissed off because they froze the card because of what Jonathan is doing. One of the quotes that I came across about this is that the only time they're not fighting is when they're on stage. And at first I thought, well, I don't exactly know how to react to that. I could react to that in a number of ways. On the one hand, it shows that music can really conquer all, because when the feeling's right, even if the person around you is someone that you're suing for allegedly stealing your money, you can still play Don't Stop Believing in a way that delights and excites the audiences. And Journey is one of these bands that they do still play live. Obviously, Steve Perry, not the original singer. The original singer was Greg Raleigh, of course. But Steve Perry, the famous singer, he's no longer with them. But Arnel Pineda, who's been with the band now for decades, no one's getting any younger, but they're still sounding good, and they're playing it live, which other bands, when they reach a certain age, aren't. But I say good for them. And there are other instances. I mean, look at Fleetwood Mac. When they were at their peak, they were all divorcing each other and sleeping with each other and doing drugs with each other and hating each other and writing songs about how much they hate each other, but still performing well. So on the one hand, it is, yeah, music conquers all. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is through the lens of cynicism, that they don't need any more money. Well, Maybe after the lawsuit they will. But obviously they've been very commercially successful, Journey. They're not one of these bands that were a cult band. They were the opposite of that. Everyone knew them, and most of those people loved them. They sold lots of records. They weren't screwed particularly badly by the record labels the way some people were. I mean, the record labels did screw everyone, but they weren't screwed that badly. And so they're not doing it for the money, I don't think. Are they doing it for the love? Well, certainly not for the love of each other, because they keep suing each other and telling the media how the other guy is supporting the wrong president. It's all quite funny. But so there's the cynical way to look at it. And then there's another way to look at it. Maybe they really are just doing it for the fans. Because I don't know, if you wanted to see a reunion of, I don't know, the Ozrock 10, who are the Ozark, who sung Jackie Blue? Help me out in the chat. I'm gonna look it up. I always get okay, the Ozark Mountain Daredevils, of course, and they did Jackie Blue, a really good song from 1974. But they're not exactly going to sell out big stadiums and big arenas. Journey still can, because everyone wants to hear Don't Stop Believin' be played live by at least a couple of the original people who played on the original track. And so there's different ways to look at it, but bands do sue each other for different reasons. Sometimes it genuinely is about creativity with a bit of ego mixed on the side. Going back to Pink Floyd, Roger Waters didn't think that David Gilmour was at all entitled to call himself, along with Richard Wright and Nick Mason, Pink Floyd. And he may have had a strong point, because he was, apart from the Syd Barrett era, the creative force who came up with the concepts. And when you're a concept band, which Pink Floyd was, the concepts are pretty damn important. He came up with the concepts. He came up with all of the lyrics, a lot, and then eventually almost all of the music by the end of the 70s. It was really his band in all but name. And so that was a sort of creative difference. And then you have the Guess Who, where the drummer, who is the original drummer, a man called Peterson, I think it's a Gary Peterson. Again, one of the fun things about live streams that you can look stuff up. Guess Who drummer. Yeah, Gary Peterson. Is that what I said? I think I said that. So he's been with the band for ages. And through various deals that were done, he acquired the name Guess Who, but he's gone out on tour with musicians who have nothing to do with the Guess Who at all. And Burton Cummings, the sort of main writer and lead vocalist for the band in their glory days, he is sued to stop them from playing the songs. Now, because he owns the name, he can't be stopped from using the name. But what Cummings has done is he's invoking a relatively unused part of the law, which says that even when you're going to receive a royalty payment for having your song performed live, I'm going to withdraw my own publishing rights from the public, essentially. And so that sort of bad blood, which is kind of sad, but at the same time, Gary Peterson's band is not at all the Guess Who. It doesn't look, smell, or act like the Guess Who. And let's be honest, the Guess Who are not a band known for drumming, which is why when Carl Palmer goes out with ELP style music, one, E and L are sadly dead. And the other reason is Carl Palmer's drumming was a huge factor in ELP. It's when Jason Bonham, who doesn't call himself Led Zeppelin, but when he'll play a Led Zeppelin song in other bands that he's in, that's fine, because he's the living legacy of his father. And like Carl Palmer, John Bonham was a lead drummer, if you will. Gary Peterson seems like a nice enough guy, not a lead drummer. And so without Burton Cummings or Randy Bachman, it just doesn't necessarily feel like things. So there's that lawsuit. But an interesting question for people when they watch this, the thing about, are most lawsuits in music about creative differences or personality differences? Matt Fisher, for instance, the original organist who later rejoined the band for Procol Harum, suing Gary Brooker for years over trying to get a co-composition right for Whiter Shade of Pale. And it was kind of sad. I don't know if they reconciled before Gary Brooker died a few years ago. But what made me think about this was Rick Beato, the most famous YouTube music streamer of all, mentioned that he got one of these nasty comments, which I occasionally get on some videos, from someone saying, "Hey, when that friend of yours was playing Whiter Shade of Pale, he did it wrong." And Rick, defending his friend, who I'm sorry I forget the name, but extremely talented keyboard player, he fired back saying, "This guy learned 20 different compositions in one day and played them all damn near perfect, without real rehearsal. Could you do that?" And the person replied, "Well, not for 19 of them, but for one of them I could, because I co-wrote it and played on it. And that was Whiter Shade of Pale. And this was Matthew Fisher, of course, the real one." And so I'd love Rick to do one of his interviews with Matthew Fisher, while he still can, because obviously Gary Brooker, the leader of that wonderful band, Procol Harum, is no more. But Matthew can tell his tale, and maybe he could even answer the question as to whether they did reconcile after years of suing each other over that. And then there was always the Spirit lawsuit against Led Zeppelin. And this is one thing that I've noticed. Yes, living artists will every now and then sue one another for copyright infringement, but it's usually the dead ones. There's a lot of dead plaintiffs in copyright lawsuits, and there's a reason for this. Artists are generally not too nasty about being the influence on someone else, because imitation being the sincerest form of flattery and all that. If someone else's song sounds like my song, most musicians are going to be pretty happy about it. I mean, there was one song that sounded just like Lost Dance with Mary Jane, the Tom Petty song. I don't remember what it was. It was a song by a much less consequential group than Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And they asked Tom, and he said, "Yeah, I probably could sue them, but I won't." Tom was a nice guy, and I think that most musicians, at least when they reach a certain level of fame, they tend to think that, which is why Randy California, the leader of Spirit, never sued Led Zeppelin in his lifetime, but his estate did. And I honestly don't hear any similarities between the Spirit song, whose name I can't remember, and Stairway to Heaven's introduction. It is so superficial. Then there are others that do sound alike. And, Marvin Gaye was one of the most influential songwriters of all time, because not only was he a performer, but a great songwriter. And his estate sues people left and right. Where Marvin, in his lifetime, even though he was very influential on so many different genres of music, I don't recall him ever doing that. And maybe it's because lawyers think differently than artists. And then there's the heartbreaking ones. When Men at Work was sued by a management company that owned the rights to the Australian children's song, Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree. Now, the woman who wrote that wrote the song, I think she was like a YWCA, or no, a Girl Scout leader, and she wrote the song for kids. She didn't write it for commercial purposes. And in her lifetime, she never had a problem with Land Down Under, the song that her estate, not her estate, but the people who bought the rights to her composition eventually sued. And this is obviously the flute part. I'm going to get the name of the man because it's a sad story. It was Greg Ham. So Greg Ham played the flute part in Land Down Under, and and people thought that sounded like Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree. And no one had touched it until a game show in Australia made that reference. And they sued and they sued and they sued. And the tragic part was there's several tragedies. One, the composer of the song made it clear that the song was, she called it, a gift to the children of Australia. And while Men at Work, by definition, they weren't boys at work, they were men at work. They weren't the children of Australia. But that song became a song that it put Australia on the map, which it probably didn't need to because it's pretty big. It's not very hard to find. But the point is, if ever I can't think of any other country that had a song on the pop charts that became a kind of de facto national anthem in the eyes of the world. I mean, Born in the USA is an anti-war song that Ronald Reagan was told not to use. Um, Anarchy in the UK, I suppose that's kind of an alternative national anthem to the UK. I mean, but all joking aside, there was something just very life affirming about "Do you come from the land down under?" and everyone loved it. And so, but this lawsuit took some of the magic away. And Greg Ham sadly died not long after the lawsuit was lost by Men at Work, and his bandmate said that the stress of the whole thing really drove him into substances and depression. And so I think we definitely need reform of copyright law, copyright regulations, I should say, throughout the world, because several things. There should be something where everyone should be able to fairly use copyrighted material on YouTube. If you ask, why don't I play the songs I'm talking about? Because of fair use. And unlike someone like Rick Beato, I'm not yet anyway selling a book or merchandise. I think that artists should definitely be able to opt out, but I think that unless they do that, there should be an automatic opt in where if someone's using it for fair use, they can use it. And if someone's even using it for commercial purposes, just have, if they're making any money off of it, let a portion of that pay a royalty. And if they're not making any money off of it, just sit around and wait till they do. Unless you opt out. If you're like Don Henley and don't want anyone to talk about, think about, or listen to the Eagles without paying him in advance, that's one thing. But I think most artists really don't mind people exercising fair use. And I don't even think most would mind commercializing it if, let's say, I wanted to make a TikTok video of me dancing to someone's music and a royalty was paid out of what I would make. I don't think most artists would mind that. And I also think that we need to make copyright law something that returns the burden of proof more to something that's tangible, as opposed to something where they split hairs so much. And for me, the Land Down Under lawsuit was one that really made me think this has got to stop. There needs to be, and the way to do this from a legal standpoint, they need to be able to, I think, show malice rather than just influence. So unless it's an exact replica, unless it's a cover song where they changed some of the words or some of the melody line, okay, throw the book at them. But if it's something that's just been unconsciously influenced by someone, you've got to be able to prove what in law they call actual malice. Did this person actually have an intent to steal someone else's art and pass it off on their own, or were they merely unconsciously influenced by the music around them? And after all, as Frank Zappa said, I'm just as influenced by the things I hate as the things I like. I think we'll go out on that note. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel because that will help me, according to the YouTube gods, not YouTube. I don't think Bono's in charge. If he is, that would be a bit different. So like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.